My mother handed me a piece of paper across her kitchen table, and I thought it was a shopping list. It was an invoice. $1,500 a month, written in her tidy cursive, for the childhood bedroom I was sleeping in, with my 2 kids on the floor beside me. That was the moment I understood exactly where I stood in my own family, and it's a moment I'll never stop replaying. My name is Rachel Doyle. I'm 31. And 8 months ago, I was sitting in a parking garage outside a family court building, both hands frozen on the wheel, unable to make myself turn the key. My daughter Maya, 6 years old, and my son Theo, 4, were strapped in behind me, tired, confused, asking when we'd get to go back home. I couldn't answer them, because home didn't exist anymore. My marriage to Nathan had just ended, and in the settlement, he kept the house we'd spent 5 years turning into a life. I walked out with a used Honda, a couple of duffel bags, and a bank balance hovering around $600. There was exactly one door I could knock on, my mother's. Linda Doyle still lived in the same rambling old house, in the town where I grew up, the same house she'd raised me and my younger sister, Casey, in. Casey was 26, single, no kids, and had moved back into her old room almost 2 years earlier, after walking away from a job in event planning to find her direction. Nobody in the family ever brought up rent with her. Not once. It simply wasn't a conversation that existed. When I called my mother that night, my voice breaking apart mid-sentence, my kids dozing off in their car seats, she didn't hesitate. She told me to pack up and come straight there. I remember her exact words, because I clung to them for weeks afterward. Rachel, this house is still your house. Stay as long as you need. That's what a mother's for. I believed every syllable of it. I pulled Maya and Theo out of their old school on a Tuesday, loaded up whatever fit in the trunk, and moved us into my childhood bedroom, the cramped one at the end of the hall, with the sloped ceiling you had to duck under near the closet. There was no bed waiting for us. My mother promised she'd sort something out soon, but that first night, all we had was an old air mattress, dragged out of the crawl space, half flat and smelling like dust. It could barely hold my weight alone, so Maya and Theo curled up on quilts spread across the hardwood floor. I told myself this was a chapter, not the whole book. I was certain it would pass quickly. I was wrong, on every count. The first few weeks were rough, but survivable. My mother made dinner most evenings, the kids slowly settled into their new elementary school, and I threw myself into freelance graphic design work between job applications, trying to rebuild something that looked like stability. Casey, meanwhile, barely registered that we existed. She stayed locked in her routine, her shows, her phone calls that stretched past midnight, her dishes left soaking in the sink for days. She moved through that house like she owned every inch of it, because functionally, she did. Nobody ever asked her to contribute a dime. Then came the Thursday that split my life into before and after. I was at the kitchen table, walking Theo through his letters, when my mother set that invoice down in front of me, $1,500, underlined twice, in blue ink. I stared at it, certain I was misreading something. I wasn't. "Mom, what is this supposed to be?" I asked. She stood by the counter, coffee in hand, as composed as if she'd just handed me a coupon. "You've been here 3 weeks now." I mentioned it to Diane down the street, and she said a room like yours easily rents for $1,500. "I'm not running a shelter here, Rachel." I couldn't get a word out at first. I looked around that kitchen, the same room where she'd told me this house was still mine, and something inside me quietly rearranged itself, for good. $1,500, for a sagging air mattress and 2 children sleeping on bare floorboards, while my sister, one door down the hall, had contributed nothing for 2 straight years without so much as a raised eyebrow from anyone. "Does Casey pay you rent?" I asked, point blank. My mother set her mug down, slowly. "Casey's circumstances aren't the same as yours. Why not? I pushed. Explain to me how they're not the same. She said nothing. She just picked her coffee back up and walked out of the room, and that silence answered every question I hadn't dared to ask out loud. I paid that first month, because I had no other option. It wiped out nearly every dollar I'd earned from a freelance contract, and I handed it to her in cash, at that same kitchen table, while she counted every bill without a single word of thanks. Casey sat in the next room with the television on, oblivious, or indifferent, I never figured out which. That night, I sat on the deflating mattress, listening to my kids breathe in their sleep just a few feet away, and I made myself one promise. I was getting my children out of that house, and I would never again ask my mother for a single thing. For the next 6 weeks, I ran myself ragged. Mornings meant dropping the kids at school and opening my laptop before I'd even finished my coffee. Afternoons meant pickup, dinner, homework, bedtime stories, and then more work, stretching well past midnight. I applied to every apartment within a reasonable drive of their school. I rebuilt my credit from scratch with a secured card. I reached out to old contacts from my years in marketing, before I'd ever gotten married. Slowly, painfully, things started to shift in my favor. And still, the rent kept coming due. $1,500 the second month. $1,500 the third. $1,500 the fourth. By the 4-month mark, I had handed my mother $6,000 to let my children sleep on a floor. Casey's total contribution over that same stretch was $0, and, memorably, a box of pastries she brought home once, on a random Sunday. Then, one afternoon, my phone rang while I was waiting in the school pickup line. It was a property manager named Owen Reyes, calling about a 2-bedroom unit I'd toured weeks earlier. The previous tenant's application had collapsed, and the place was mine, if I could sign the lease by Friday and cover the deposit. I actually teared up, right there in the car line. I told him yes before he'd even finished explaining the terms. That evening, over dinner, I told Maya and Theo to start picking out which toys mattered most for the move. Maya asked if she'd finally get her own bed. Yes, sweetheart, I told her. Your very own bed. I promise you that. The next day, I began packing quietly, no announcements, no drama, just boxes filled a little at a time, ready to load into the car in stages, before signing Friday. But my mother noticed. She appeared in my doorway that Thursday afternoon, while I folded the kids' laundry, arms crossed, wearing an expression I'd never seen on her before, not quite anger, more like she was doing math in her head. Where, exactly, do you think you're going? She asked. I found us an apartment, I said. We're leaving Friday. She went quiet for a beat, then said, You owe me $6,000 before you take one step out of this house. I stopped, mid-fold. I already paid you $6,000, Mom. 4 months, $1,500 each. That was rent. That covered rent, she said. Not utilities. Not groceries. Not the wear on that room. I did the math. 6,000 more. Those kids aren't leaving until I see it. I stared at her for a long moment. Then I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and scrolled through 4 months of dated, time-stamped transfers. Then I opened my email and showed her the signed lease, with Friday's move-in date printed at the top. Then I did something she clearly never expected me to do. I called her bluff, completely and calmly. Mom. If you try to physically stop me from taking my kids out of this house, that's unlawful restraint, and I will call the police. Every payment is documented. Every conversation is saved. I have a signed lease, a car that runs, and 2 children who deserve real beds to sleep in. She stepped back from the doorway, not because she'd suddenly found some hidden well of conscience, but because she realized the woman standing in front of her wasn't the same one who'd sobbed into a phone from a parking garage 4 months earlier. I had rebuilt myself in the cracks of her house, while she was busy counting my cash and looking straight through my children, and she hadn't even noticed it happening. Casey stood at the end of the hallway, watching the whole thing unfold. She didn't say a word either. I finished packing that night. Friday morning, I loaded the car while my kids ate their last bowl of cereal at that kitchen table. My mother sat in the living room, arms still crossed, and didn't lift a finger to help, didn't say a single goodbye. As I buckled Theo into his car seat, he looked up at me and asked, Mommy, are we going to our home now? Yes, baby, I told him. Our home. Ours. The new apartment wasn't much, small rooms, second-hand furniture, discount bed frames. I assembled myself, while my kids ran laughing circles through the empty space. But that first night, when I tucked Maya into her own mattress and she stretched out and sighed, "This feels so good, Mom," it was worth more than any amount my mother could have ever charged me. What that season of my life taught me is something I hope stays with anyone listening. Being desperate doesn't mean you're doomed to stay that way. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally are the ones who'll put the steepest price tag on the smallest act of kindness. And the goal isn't to let that turn you bitter, it's to let it make you unbreakable. I didn't fall apart in that parking garage. I didn't fall apart on that half-flat mattress. I didn't fall apart when she slid that invoice across the table, and I wasn't about to fall apart standing in my own childhood doorway either. If any part of this reminded you of your own impossible rooms, your own family members who measured your worth in dollar signs, then you're exactly who these stories are made for. Stick around, because every week, we bring you real accounts of people who came out the other side, because the hardest chapter you're living through right now isn't the end of your story. It's just where you start becoming who you're meant to be. Rachel Doyle walked out that Friday morning, and she never once looked back.